Welcome, everybody.
Hi, everyone. Great to have you all joining us. And it's nice to be seeing many new friends, I have to say. I feel like really appreciative of the folks that I'm having the chance to work with. Yeah, so good to see old friends and new friends. Yeah. I feel like there's still folks hopping in from the waiting room. So I don't know, like, Ellie, you can give the go ahead for when it will be good to get started.
I think we can get started now.
Okay, great. So I'm gonna quick introduce today's session. I'm gonna turn this over to Courtney, and you're gonna see like Courtney and John and I are gonna sort of move back and forth in leading different pieces, but I will share screen initially. So welcome everyone. For those of you who are sort of along for the full ride of coaching and participating in the full series, you will know that this is our third whole group session as part of this particular professional learning initiative surrounding trauma-informed practice in schools. For those of you joining us for the first time just for this session, super happy to have you with us. You know, again, there's sort of different ways that folks are interacting with this work. I'm Paul Hyry-Dermuth from Bright and the Brookline Center, here with our amazing teammates, Courtney Tucker, John Crocker from the Massachusetts School Mental Health Consortium, Ellie Sanchez from the Rennie Center, and welcome any other teammates who may have just joined. I can't see you because I'm sharing screen, but yeah, so great to have everyone. And as mentioned, so this is our session on supplemental and intensive support. So as we think about it, interventions across the tiers, focusing a little bit more on tiers 2 and 3. We will do like kind of a slight review of what we did last session. And we'll also kind of do some digging back, thanks to Courtney, into just the shared understanding about trauma and trauma responsiveness more broadly that we've been working to build. So again, super happy to have you all. Just as a very quick reminder, I know like we at Bright are feeling super blessed about this opportunity to work with the Massachusetts School Mental Health Consortium and the Rennie Center on Thriving Minds. This particular initiative, we're super grateful to the Center for Child Wellbeing and Trauma for funding and supporting. And we're also grateful for some of our other work for funding from the Massachusetts Department of Education. So yeah, and there will be a follow-up survey for folks. We hope that you will just take a couple minutes to do that going forward so that we can be kind of getting a sense of how all of this work is landing for you all. So and with that, I am happy to turn it over to Courtney to get us started.
Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Courtney and I'm with the Bright team. And so one of the things that we're just going to walk you through and kind of talk you through as a team, it's just these guiding questions that you have here. So we're going to just think about, you know, what is trauma? What we hear it, it's almost become a buzzword nowadays. You hear it everywhere, and really what causes it? How does it impact the individual? How does it even impact our system? And why do we even want to use it as an idea or a framework with which to think about mental health supports? So those are our guiding questions today. And what we're going to do is I want to start you off. Well, we're going to watch this clip. And this clip, the whole premise behind this clip is that kids do well if they can. And so it talks about this idea of how are we actually thinking about kids, how kids do well if they can? How are we actually thinking about mental health? Can we begin to think about it in a way that it actually allows us to lean into it just like we would if we were thinking about a kid having a learning disability or a kid having difficult. We say you want to do something that appeals to all the different learning styles and learning modalities. What if we approach mental health the same way? What would that outcome be? So I'm going to let you listen to this talk from Jay Stewart, probably about 4 minutes. And then I want you to just capture, why do you think this is hard? And you can put that in the chat as it's going along, but we really want to discuss what makes the message that he's saying and giving out hard to hold on to.
And the reality is that most of what I've learned that flies in the face of conventional wisdom can be summed up in a pretty simple phrase. And this is it. Kids do well if they can, which has become the guiding philosophy of our work, the foundation of our work. And when you look at it up here, you probably say to yourself, what's so earth-shattering about that? And on its own, it may not seem particularly earth-shattering, but it actually is, and I want to explain why. See, what kids do well if they can suggests is that if a kid could do well, he would do well. If she could do well, she would do well. And if she's not doing well, something must be standing in her way. And if something's standing in her way, then we all, as the helpers in her life, we need to figure out what's standing in her way so we can help. And I'm sure that sounds like perfect common sense to everybody, because it is. And yet, it flies in the face of conventional wisdom, because the more conventional way of thinking when it comes to challenging behavior is not kids do well if they can. It sounds a lot more like kids do well if they want to. And you see, if you believe kids do well if they want to, and a kid's not doing well, so for instance, they're not behaving well, you believe kids do well if they want to, they're not behaving well, then you're going to assume the reason he's not behaving well is because he doesn't want to. And if he doesn't want to, then what's all of our jobs? To try to make him want to do well. And while that probably seems like a very narrow, unpleasant, probably pretty ineffective role to play in the lives of these kids, the interesting thing about it is when you think about traditional discipline in our homes, traditional school discipline, discipline in society, it is all oriented around trying to make kids want to do well. Rewards, punishments, timeouts, detention, suspensions, expulsions, you name it, they are all aimed at trying to motivate people to do better, safe in the assumption that they're not doing well because they don't want to. Well, you know what? I don't buy it. What I've learned is it doesn't make any sense. What I've learned is kids do well if they can. I believe kids do well if they can. I believe if a kid could do well, he would do well. And if he's not doing well, you know what? Something has got to be standing in his way, and it cannot be as simple as he just doesn't want to. I also believe that it's high time we learn from more than 50 years of research in the neurosciences that has shown beyond the shadow of a doubt that conventional wisdom is wrong. Now, there are countless examples in our history of where conventional wisdom sticks around a lot longer after it's been disproven. You can go back to something like the world is flat. Well, you know what? We learned it was round, but nobody wanted to part with the idea that it was flat. I think we're going to find the same thing about the notion that kids do well if they want to. All of the research in the neurosciences for the past 50 years has shown beyond the shadow of a doubt that challenging kids do not lack the will to behave well, they lack the skills to behave well. Skills to behave well, what kind of skills am I talking about? I'm talking about skills like problem solving, like flexibility, like frustration tolerance. In other words, what all the research in the neurosciences has shown us is that kids who exhibit chronic challenging behavior, you know what? They have like a learning disability, except instead of areas like reading, math, and writing, this learning disability is in areas like problem solving, flexibility, frustration tolerance. I think it's actually a very accurate, apt, and powerful analogy. And here's why. I'm in my mid-40s. If we went back to when I was in elementary school, actually not far from here, if there was a child who was reading several grade levels behind his peers, back then, well-meaning, empathic, caring educators would not have said to themselves, I wonder if he has a learning disability. I wonder if he's got dyslexia. I wonder if he has a hard time phonetically decoding words. No, actually 40 years ago, those folks would have said, I wonder if he is either dumb or lazy. And I know that there are people sitting here listening right now who can attest to the personal pain of that, to being the child in the classroom who ironically was trying harder than anybody else in that classroom to read and was completely misunderstood. You know what's interesting about that? Guess who wasn't trying very hard in that classroom to read? The students to whom it came naturally. Guess who was trying harder than anybody else? The very kids that we used to think were lazy. What a terrible shame. Thank goodness we have come a long way since then, but not when it comes to kids with challenging behavior.
So one of the things that I want you all to do, as I stated in the chat, is I want you to think about what makes it challenging for members of the school community to really believe that kids do well if they can versus if they want to, right? Paul, you got a big black box in the middle of the screen. And then also just wondering, and if any of you have an example where you're like a kid was struggling and they were trying and you were able to maintain compassion and honor their efforts, you know, as they were going through. Just share that. Feel free to unmute and share it. Feel free to share it in the chat. I just want to hear your thoughts. Like, what makes this idea hard? This concept hard? Yeah, Colleen said, you know what? They don't have the training. So they really believe and they can't hit on it being a skills deficit, right? It hits against our feelings of being overwhelmed and you all are exactly right. Teacher professional exhaustion, right? Yes. Personal experience. You are correct, Phil. Kids get labeled as manipulative for trying to get their needs met. That is true. It fits their personal narrative, right? That's what I did. What they can't say. Yes. If a student doesn't want to, it takes responsibility off of our plate, right? If we believe it's just because they don't want to, it takes off the responsibility that we have to do something different off our plate, right? So the next thing to think about is just, you know, Brene Brown shares that when you start looking at people and children, you know, she said someone as they are, they're doing the best they can in the moment. They say it changes your worldview. It changes how you show up, right? And how you respond, right? We want to believe that all kids can do it and we blame them when they can't, right? And then we'll blame their parents. If we can't blame them, we blame the parents, right? It becomes one or the other. And it's just the blame game that goes back and forth, right? And Craig's like, those kids are a pain in the butt for parents to deal with and adults because they just don't give us what we want when we want it. They're not giving it to us. And then if we're honest, they trigger some of our own ego and some of our own adequacy stuff because we're like, I should be able to handle you and I can't handle you. What message does it tell us about ourselves, right? And she said, sometimes kids tell they're choosing. And Ruth is like, wait, I can't hold on to that because I got to keep this academic pace going. So I can't let go because I got to keep this pace. I got group kids. I got to move them. I can't wait. I got to keep it going, right? They're like, these are things. And they say, I'm trying. It's not working. And how many people want to admit that I'm failing, right? But not look at it as failure, but an opportunity for growth. And then some people are like, I ain't got time to reach out for help. I'm trying to keep the class moving. So this is what makes all of that kind of hard. And it makes it hard for us to embrace it and to lean into it. And one of the things, Paul, if you could show the next slide, that I just want to show you all and just remind everyone of, it's really what we're trying to hone in, and the point that we're here and what's really important is that we just want to get to the place that when we're saying, and I know I told you all, you hear trauma informed all the time, not just when someone says somebody has experienced trauma, I want you to look at it as sometimes you want to say someone has experienced a wound that they can't make heal. And it's a wound they got to learn to live with, right? And so what does that mean when we start doing that and we say trauma informed? We're simply saying we don't want to cause no more wounds. So how are we leaning in and being intentional? And Paul and John are going to talk to you all about, like, how are we being intentional about not causing any more wounds to systems that are already have enough of them, right? And are being complicated in interactions by having them. And when do we reach the point that we understand even the difficult behaviors that it's really hard for us to, accept that they're communicating something to us? And in the diagrams that I'm showing you, you'll see that on one side, it's an optimal brain. It's like the brain, it's lighting up on all parts. Oh, Paul, you went too fast for me. It's lighting up on all parts. And then the other part, it's like, it's not lighting up, right? When you're stressed, when you're anxious, when there's a lot of fear, when we're in fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, I can't access my upper brain. It's very few that's going there. And on the next slide, Paul will show you, you'll see that it even tells you, like it lays out for you, look, when I'm calm and alert, I can access upper portions of my brain, 85%. And that's where I'm thinking. That's where my moral clauses come in. That's where all of that happens. But when I'm in fight, flight, I'm only accessing 5% of it. So when people, you ask somebody, why did you just do what you did? And they're like, I don't know. They really literally don't know. They can't tell you in that moment. Like, why did they do what they do? So as we go to the next slide, one of the things to begin to think about is just, we want you all, as you're hearing the conversations and you're leaning in, is just to remember that thinking and learning is an upper, and reasoning is an upper brain function. And that only happens after there has been regulation in the body and there has been a connection. So we got to have regulation, and they have to feel connected to themselves, that I know what's happening in my body, and I have to feel a connection to my environment. So it's regulate, relate, and then we get to the reasoning, the reflecting, and the learning, and all that other stuff. And so when we begin to say that we're going to take a trauma-informed, or we can say a more do no more harm approach, is we're actually saying that, you know what, we're going to recognize the importance of, when you're dysregulated, actually helping you regulate. We're going to realize the importance of you having connection before we continue and we lean in and we do more. Next slide, Paul. One of the things then that we see is that when we're dealing with anxiety and depression and trauma, I'm pretty sure you look at this list and you're like, man, I've seen all of these, right? Provocative behavior, high emotions. I would even say we probably could look at this list, and if we're honest, and be like, since COVID, I've seen some of this in myself. Poor memory retention, like lack of motivation, disinterest, avoiding some work, just all of these things are happening. And so these are just some things that tell us what's happening as people are experiencing, and they're dysregulated, and we're more in our bottom than our upper brain. Next slide, Paul. And so as we think about that, I wanted to just read a poem for you all that kind of emphasizes this idea of, and Paul, you got a black box, that kind of emphasizes this idea that, we're not in the business of healing or resolving trauma. We're not that powerful, but we can facilitate a healing process. We can facilitate growth, and we can remind people of their inherent worth, and that they're not the problem. It's not their fault, right? And thereby mitigate the devastating impacts of trauma. The biggest thing that people can hear and understand is that it's not my fault, right? And that somebody believes that I can change. And so with that, one of the things that we're advocating for, next slide, please, Paul, is that we're advocating for the school becoming a therapeutic environment, right? And we're simply saying, how does it become an environment that provides protection, support, and education, right? That's what we're asking for. Can it be an environment that provides protection, support, and education? And you all might be like, Courtney, what does that mean? And I'm like, really, if you look on the next slide, what it means is we're just asking, can it be an environment where there's multiple positive connections for a student? Can the interactions be such that they become, as you can see on the right, you see a student that is relationship rich. Before they start their school day, they've had all these positive interactions with some adult in their life. And those positive interaction leads to them coming to school engaged, excited, believing I can, believing this is going to get me somewhere. And on the other side, we're seeing this happens to the student that's coming, that's in foster care, or is getting themselves ready because a parent is at work, they haven't had those positive interactions. This kid comes in a little withdrawn. It takes them a little longer to get into school. And so what we're saying is, how do we increase and make all our students have these relationship rich, these positive connections, so that it can help them regulate, it can help them relate, so that we can get to the upper brain portion, so that they can begin to do the learning, to do the reasoning, to do the reflecting that is expected of education. And that's what's important. And so now, Paul, I'm going to turn it over to you. Oh, and I just want us to remember, as I turn it over to Paul, is that it's really important within this session, as Paul and John share a lot of information with you, that we remember to focus on what's within our sphere of control. They're going to say a lot of stuff and they're going to provide a lot of ideas, but really hone in on what's within your control. Because if you let your influence and your concern get too big, you're going to get stressed out and you might not move and we might find ourselves stuck. But if we focus on our sphere of control, we shrink the change enough that it allows us to begin to make movement on some of the things that are being talked about. And the other thing is just a little diagram to say, look, we want to embrace an approach that's going to lean in and allow us to not do more harm, but to offer opportunities for resilience building and healing within our systems. Thank you. And Paul, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Courtney. And yeah, just really appreciate the framing and also everybody's thoughts in the chat that I was able to see. So perhaps no surprise, you're now taking a look at the MTSS triangle. And I will say, I think John will often say you just can't have a day without looking at the MTSS triangle at least once, or some of us can't. But just with this in mind, we do believe that this framework is the most common framework at this point for really thinking about how we're designing supports for kids. We know it's a framework that started mostly in the academic realm, in that sort of world of RTI, and then has now more and more begun to be used as a framework for thinking really about whole school planning. And in this case, this question of how can we think about this framework when we're thinking about trauma responsive practice, and really healing centered work in schools. And so just like every other context where we use MTSS, we think about the notion of core or universal at tier 1, core plus more or supplemental at tier 2, core plus more at tier 3, or intensive. And the notion that our goal is to design supports that really work for all of the kids in the school, and recognizing that if we get it right, most of the kids will be able to be successful most of the time with the core supports. Some of the kids will need the additional supplemental supports, and there will be a small number of students who need the most intensive supports. And so when we're planning for a successful whole school approach, in this case, to thinking about trauma-informed and healing-centered care, then we think that this is a good framework to be introducing. Just to recognize on the left, to note that sometimes I think we think about, or folks think about the tiers as distinguished by how they're delivered. I've heard it sort of said, tier 1 is class, tier 2 is small group, and tier 3 is, or tier 1 is whole group, tier 2 is small group, tier 3 is individual. We don't think about it that way. We recognize that there are individual supports provided at tier 1. We recognize that some tier 3 supports happen in group settings. And so what we think about is frequency, dosage, and duration for individual students. And we kind of collapse those into the notion of intensity. So the idea of what distinguishes the tiers is intensity. So just wanted to kind of give us that familiar framework for thinking this piece forward. And then to say, when we think about trauma-informed and healing-centered supports in schools, these are kind of the broad categories that we think about. I'm going to just briefly do a quick review on tier 1 in a second, based on what we talked about in our last session. And then today, John's going to take us into a much deeper dive around some of the key opportunities and supports in tier 2, and a little bit into kind of moving into tier 3. I'm going to talk about kind of the upper tier 3 interventions and supports, and we will have time along the way for you all to kind of process this in small groups, but that's where we're heading. And so, and we recognize different schools have kind of different ways of framing all of this. But we offer this kind of like as a comprehensive way of thinking about trauma-informed and healing-centered supports in schools. So just a super quick review of tier 1, just to frame us all. And for those of you who weren't able to join us in a prior session, if you're interested in the the slides from the last session. We can happily get those to you, as well as the recording. So just want to say that if you want a deeper dive into the tier 1, in particular the classroom pieces that we shared the last time. But if we look from a framework of what are some of the things that can constitute school, tier 1, thinking about trauma and, trauma-informed work at tier 1. First of all, there's these school-wide pieces, right? So as we know, like lots of schools now are moving to some version of core social emotional learning curricula as part of the work of becoming universally trauma-informed. Sometimes that looks like a kind of a little bit of a standalone curriculum that's offered during a certain block of the day, or by teachers, at a certain point in the day. Sometimes there's a goal to really integrate social emotional learning, core social emotional learning into academic instruction. We don't have a strong opinion about the right way to do that, just to recognize that's one key practice, just having a core universal approach to social emotional learning. Then secondly, just to recognize, then there's what we think about as kind of school-wide trauma responsive work. So for example, tier 1 work at PBIS, right? So the work to create predictable, kind of consistent, calm approaches to how we are in all spaces in the school, the sort of like PBIS hallway, cafeteria, gymnasium, and classroom, kinds of pieces. That's part of making a trauma responsive school for kids, right? Also pieces around things like whole school activities, whole school assemblies, clubs, et cetera, like just thinking about those as part of the work at tier 1. And then thirdly, how we think about a universal practice or a core practice of, in fact, identifying students in needs of additional supports. So, and we've shared that in different sessions related to both universal screening and then also kind of what are strong school-wide referral systems. So the idea that part of tier 1 work is in fact figuring out which kids may need tier 2 and tier 3 supports, so that we're not kind of constantly getting caught by surprise through crises or unexpected, things that kids are bringing. So those are some of the school-wide pieces we think about. And then, as you all know, last time we took a pretty deep dive into this set of trauma-informed classroom practices that John shared based on the Methuen trauma-informed classroom standards that he and his colleagues have developed. So I'm kind of rolling up the list here. We won't go to them in detail today, but just as a reminder, we do have the slides, and we're actually working on kind of a graphic organizer that folks can use to, for teachers to be doing kind of classroom level self-assessment for folks to really look and say, how does my practice in my classroom compare to this set of practices and standards that are trauma informed? So that's our quick review on tier 1, and ready to sort of move things along. I'm going to stop sharing, John, so you can pick it up and you can move slides in tier 2, so you won't have to be constantly reminding me to do that. So yeah, great. But thanks everyone, and back to you in a little bit when we get to tier 3.
Thank you so much, Paul. That was really helpful. And Courtney, love the frame. Appreciate it a lot. Can we see the tier 2 slides, my friends? Yes? Okay. So I'm thrilled to be able to share today around some of the interventions that you will see at tier 2 and then leading into tier 3. One of the things that I so appreciate about Paul, and when we talk shop about MTSS, is this call back to intensity. It's a way that I think allows for us to move beyond this idea of a modality living in a tier, as opposed to the application of that modality and the intensity of that application really being the thing that distinguishes which tier it lands in. I'll use an example that I think probably rides the line. So TFCBT, pretty intensive therapeutic modality. Maybe we're offering that to an individual kid, and maybe that is upper tier 2. But the intensity of, when I think intensive tier 3 intervention, I'm thinking sometimes programmatic. Paul's going to get into this in a big way. I'm thinking there is an aspect of it that is crisis response, but it is the case that the modality can shift between the level of intensity of your application of modality is really what's going to dictate which tier it lands in. So I definitely appreciate that. Some stuff that you'll find, tier 2, we've got things like individual counseling, TFCBT, group interventions. I'm a big proponent of group therapy models that I think can really serve to advance the scope of services that are provided by a school and address prevalence rates that sit in the 30s and 40s, unfortunately, right now. So food for thought there. We're going to dig into some of the specifics of this, and then we'll get into some critical incident management. One call out before we jump into the specifics is this idea. What do we think about this? Look at the 2 MTSS triangles on the right. I'd love to hear your thoughts. How close to reality is that second MTSS triangle in your district? Let's come off mute and share. Kevin, yeah. Sorry, bud. Is this resonating with people? What do you think?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Right. I mean, I think when we look at, right, the absence of that tier 2, and we see a lot of just like the intensive tier 3, and then really just more of the tier 1, and we're kind of missing that middle part. I think we're seeing a lot of that. And I think, even I think of conversations I've had with colleagues, even colleagues that are on the Zoom right now, just talking about how, there can oftentimes be a lot of pushback from administrators or whomever, right? Kind of saying, how do we support all these kids that we have in tier 3? How do we support all the kids we have in tier 3? And the reality is, right, well, we shouldn't be putting so much focus on how to provide individual supports to 30, 40, 50, 60% plus of kids. We need to relook at our tier 1, right? If that's the situation we're finding ourselves in.
Well said, my friend. I appreciate the fact that you're here. Colleen, what do you got?
So we've done a lot of work on this. So we were definitely the second one 3 years ago, and it's a multi-year project. And I feel like right now, for the first time since I started in this building, we have a substantial tier 2, and there's still room for improvement, but we're feeling the results. So, but it's a long haul for work.
Yeah, Colleen, no, for sure. You got to be intentional, right? Because what's the easy thing to do? The easy thing to do is to say, this kid needs help. Get him individual help now, immediately, and intensively. Let's go straight to tier 3. Let's not even consider something that's perhaps less intense. So it sounds like this is resonating with people. Yes. Give me a quick thumbs up if you're like, yeah, man, this is a problem. Okay. Quite a few of you. All right. I mean, I think when this happens, we do undermine our efficacy and our efficiency. When we don't consider interventions that are perhaps less intense, well, we overwhelm our system. We're not able to get to all of our students. We also don't foster prevention. We also don't allow ourselves to perhaps provide a less intense intervention that is perhaps more time limited, that will allow for us to actually promote prevention. When we are not able to look for emerging concerns or provide supports for individuals who require less intense interventions for emerging concerns, then all we do is spend our time at the top of the triangle. And that doesn't lend itself really well to being able to provide supports for the entire population. So food for thought here. We got to be intentional about building out that tier 2. And if we don't, there are some pretty significant implications that will make it almost impossible to get to all of our kids. Faye offers, I sometimes think our triangle's upside down and our time, attention, and resources are spent on the top tier. Yeah, Faye, makes sense. Challenging to live with the daily reality while shifting the framework and services. Let's be clear for sure. This is hard work, and let no one tell you otherwise. That being said, you're doing the work, and I appreciate that. Lean into it and commit to it. It can happen. All right, let's keep going. This is a critical concept, and one that I wish to share with you to maybe shift your thinking in terms of what schools should be focused on in terms of intervention. A lot of times I see schools working on passive coping, and it's actually called avoidance coping, but I feel like it's a little harsh, but it's also true. No amount of these things on the right, like taking a walk or reading a book or listening to your favorite song, or maybe like taking a break or a snack, none of it ultimately resolves an underlying problem. Unfortunately, it's not that they're bad things. These are wonderful things to get you to baseline such that you can do the active coping work of seeking to resolve the underlying problem. Does that make sense? Pretty significant concept here. Are you good with this? I need for us to perhaps shift our attention not away from passive coping, because it's still good, but passive coping that is devoid of active coping. If we don't couple those things together, we don't get results. What are we talking about when we're talking about active coping? For our CBT friends in the crowd, you're going to be happy. Things like cognitive restructuring, behavioral activation, setting up behavioral experiments, exposure, that kind of stuff. We got to work the problem. We've got to work to engage in processing and problem solving such that the problem is addressed directly. Yeah, Carolina, 100%. Adults need this stuff too. I know that you might be burning some incense in your office thinking that the problem's going to go away. It's not going away, friends. It's going to get you back to baseline so you can do the work. Yeah, scaffolding. I appreciate that. Well played. So when we're building out our interventions, let's please remember this. It's essential that let's do the mindful thing to get to baseline. Let's do the thing that will make us feel ready to do the work. And then let's do the work. There it is. I want to talk about some flavors of intervention that can happen that you might see at tier 2, that might trickle into tier 3, perhaps. But Paul's going to focus primarily on that tier 3 piece. I'm going to talk about the crisis piece associated with tier 3. Will the article be shared afterwards? Will we be able to click on the link once? Yeah, you'll be able to get the article for sure. And I'll say this, the article's good. It frames it okay. You can probably find some other stuff that's even better. It might be a little outdated at this point, but I think it does a good job of differentiating between those two concepts. And I don't think it's something that we often talk about, unfortunately. We talk about coping skills writ large, and we never differentiate, and that's the problem. So there we go. CBT, it's a form of psychological treatment. It's super effective for lots of different things. It's the gold standard for addressing concerns related to anxiety and depression. I could throw darts at a map and be certain that anxiety and depression are problems in the district for which those darts hit. It's just true. All of our districts are struggling with populations that are trying to navigate anxiety, depression, and trauma. CBT has demonstrated impact on those things. So I want to call this out as a practice, a modality that 100% can drive intervention in a way that will move the dial on symptom presentation for these specific issues. Important to emphasize that advances in CBT have been made on the basis of both research and clinical practice. It is an incredibly well researched therapeutic modality. It's also used as like the control for when new therapeutic modalities are being tested out. So please, just know that in terms of whether or not CBT is appropriate to do in schools, friends, it is absolutely appropriate. You can't hurt a kid with CBT. Can't do it, okay? You're not gonna hurt a kid by helping them to understand and adopt more rational, balanced, logical, evidence-driven thinking, to challenge automatic negative thinking, to adopt more pro-social behaviors, to increase behavioral activation, to expose them to non-damaging and non-dangerous situations that might prompt anxiety. I did hear an individual, and they said this is not going to come across right, but I'm going to say it anyway, and I'm going to say it to you now, and it's not going to come across right, but just like stay with me. No one ever died from crying. In those instances in which we are trying to engage in that exposure trial with a kid, it's not going to be easy. It will be anxiety provoking. It may evoke an emotional response, but we have to remember that it's not dangerous. It's not damaging. We're actually helping a student to get to the peak point of anxiety in that not dangerous, not damaging situation, such that they can feel better and see that they are safe. So CBT has a lot to offer schools, and I will argue that there is no better home for this modality, a place where every blessed individual is charged with fostering the critical thinking skills of the kids in their classes and in their offices. So this isn't a modality I often look to drive intervention, and it's something that is very simple at its core. Thoughts impact feelings, impact behavior, impact outcomes. Situations that are stressful may cause automatic negative thinking, such that I don't feel great. My not feeling great might cause me to behave in ways that are not super pro-social, and my outcomes might not be great as a function of that. So it's a simple concept, but it's very, very effective. Bounce Back is actually a CBT-based intervention that is free and addresses trauma for our youngest kids. This is a wonderful modality that is coming out of some work from, oh God, I'm gonna forget, but she's wonderful. I talked to her the other day. It's manualized approach that you can scoop up for free. The link's right there. CBITS is the older student version of this intervention, again, to address trauma. It was designed for schools. The idea is that ultimately, CBITS is a group-based intervention that can be implemented within, I want to say 5th through 12th grade. Has been shown to have a lot of success. If you go on the Results First database and you're looking for evidence-based modalities that can address trauma, CBITS will pop up there as a really well-vetted intervention. What else do we have? TFCBT. Who's familiar with TFCBT? Quick show of hands. Giselle. Cool. Ultimately, this was designed by NCTSN. Lots of great research to back this. Excuse me. It's an evidence-based treatment for children and adolescents impacted by trauma. It is the CBT approach with a specific emphasis on trauma. TFCBT, proven successful for kids ages 3 to 18. We're actually engaged in some work with DMH right now to get this modality into schools in a group-based kind of way. Ruth, did you have a question? You've got your hand up. I want to make sure. What do you got?
Sorry, I don't. I just raised my hand and it hasn't come down yet.
Oh, all right. Well, that's cool. I'm glad you're engaged. I appreciate that. So I think a lot of times, like, I'm mentioning a lot of stuff that ends in the word T, which, I get it. Some people get real balled up when we talk about therapy. But at the end of the day, our charge is to provide evidence-based services to kids. And I don't know of a single evidence-based counseling service that doesn't end in the word therapy. It's a lot of CBT, DBT, SFBT, REBT. We could go on and on, but that's the thing that we need to use. So let's use the thing that's effective, that is research-backed, that is ultimately aligning with the problems that our kids are coming to the table with, and that is not going to hurt them. CBT is a safe practice. This TFCBT web online learning platform is pretty fantastic. If you don't know about this, sign up. It's free. You can access this. I think there are perhaps small fees around some of these things, but totally reasonable. And if you're looking to improve practice for your clinicians, if you're looking to become more more adept at the provision of services for yourself, this is a pretty fantastic online learning platform. We're not digging into like the specific technique of CBT today because we quite frankly don't have enough time. But what we are going to be doing is highlighting some things that you can look into in the future and really dig in on. So when I think of some of the things that we've talked about to date, CBT, Bounce Back, CBITS, TFCBT, web-based platform to get some professional development and support. There we go. Let's take a look at this. This is the NCTSN Learning Center. I want to demo this for you just to give you a little bit of sense of what's in here. There's quite a bit of resources that you might not know about. Continuing education courses on all kinds of different topics. This is stuff that is ultimately at your fingertips if you know about it. But if you don't know about it, you're not going to be able to do much with it. So I would ask for you to maybe consider some of these continuing education courses, some of these modalities that I just mentioned as things that can foster tier 2 interventions within your school. Quick, I want to read the scene in terms of the people who are on the call right now. Who here feels like there's a lot of targeted professional development for your school mental health staff that aligns with their role really well in your district? Quick show of hands if you're feeling like it is never the case that it's the day before PD day and the school counselors are like, oh, or people are like, what are we going to do with the counselors? I don't want to out anyone if you've got colleagues on the call, but like, I think it's perhaps important to reflect on the fact that if we aren't intentionally designing professional development for our people, specially designed quality professional development for our counseling staff, their practice isn't going to move in the way that we want it to. We do a lot of PD to meet our needs as counseling said. Good, Patricia, I'm psyched. Gina, I know that about you. If you're not, consider the implications of not providing that quality PD. Our counseling staff they deserve to get the PD that they need to do their job well. Okay, so Paul, what are you thinking here? How much time we want to put our friends in breakout rooms?
Yeah, I think let's say like 7 minutes, and I think Ellie has them ready to go.
Awesome.
So and maybe what we can do, John, is just put the questions in the chat.
Sounds like a plan.
Yeah.
So what we're hoping for you to be able to do now is to reflect. How do tier 2, how does tier 2 in your school or district look compared to the tier 2 supports we've discussed here today? So we've talked about some pretty specific evidence-based therapeutic modalities and programming. And, you know, recognizing you can't do everything at once, what's a high priority next step for your team for tier 2? I'll paste those in the chat. Please keep them handy. And we'll join back in 7 minutes. I'm going to cycle around to some rooms and hear your conversation and not judge you. And Ellie, if you can spool up the breakout rooms, that'd be great. Hey, everybody, welcome back. I hope you got a little bit of like, it was an ease back into the room. I hope you got that like, that little message of like, it's closing. So I'm curious to hear what you think. You know, based on your discussion with your breakout groups, how does tier 2 in your school district look compared to what we've discussed here today? What do you think? Julie is just shaking her head at me.
I think for the 4 that were in my group, it needs help. Tier 2 needs help. That was kind of the consensus, especially since the pandemic. It's definitely shifted in the pandemic. If there was movement towards like a more balanced tier system, that got shaken up through the pandemic. So it's kind of like we've taken 3 or 4 steps back, and it feels that way sometimes.
That's fair.
I was shaking my head because in my head, I'm only on the screen with one other person, and it was one of my staff, and she looked like she was trying to say something. I'm like, no, you're on mute. But I think I feel really grateful in the ratios that we have here in our building. We're a collaborative, that we're lucky enough to have the support of a large group of staff, very high ratios that can help actually be able to implement the tier 2, all the tiers, honestly. And without that, like we feel like we're treading water a lot of times, but we'd be maybe under the water more often.
Totally fair.
Hi,
Yeah, I mean,
John.
oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Marie.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think in our group too, we were talking about that it's offered occasionally, not systemically across the board. And I think, you know, a lot of it sometimes has to do with like logistics and scheduling, and people don't want to touch that. But I think for me personally, it's this pushback sometimes around like pulling kids from class. And it just goes back to kind of how this conversation started, is like what needs to happen first before they can be ready to be in class. So I just think about like, it's not so much like creating the groups and getting the curriculum and offering it, it's getting everybody else on board as to why this is helpful and beneficial. And for me, at least, that's been the challenge.
Yeah, there's a culture shift that needs to happen. There's an order of operations to be able to get to great academic outcomes. And it starts with taking care of kids. But I think that is not necessarily like the immediate culture that is living in front of you. It takes a little bit to get to that. Question in the chat, we were curious if the CBT groups need to be facilitated by a trained clinician. Yes, they do. And guess who's a trained clinician? School counselors, school psychologists, adjustment counselors, social workers. Yep. All of those roles are trained clinicians. I think sometimes, friends, we use slang to define the work. Like we need an outside therapist. And what are we meaning by that? Well, we're meaning an LMHC or an LICSW or something. I think what we need to do is we need to recognize that teachers instruct, and counselors and school psychs and adjustment counselors, social workers provide therapy, counseling services. I don't know of a single evidence-based counseling theory that doesn't end in the word therapy. So yes, CBT groups are 100% within the purview of school-based mental health staff, for sure. And if you're curious in digging into that a little bit more, we have a session coming up that's on leveraging all school-based mental health staff effectively that really digs deep into staffing models and licensure requirements and all this stuff. And at the end of it, you can rest assured that you can ask your school-based mental health staff to do an awful lot that you might not yet know about. So check out the Thriving Minds website to get that session on the books for your team. Paul offers, one thing I've heard from a lot of schools that kids are identified as having a need for tier 2 supports, and maybe go to a place for support while the actual intervention what we're trying to accomplish with kids isn't clearly identified.
And
Yeah.
John, if I can throw something in from our little group, I think it's related to Paul's point because one of our group members described basically a tier 2 team and that place in which that clarity can kind of live and grow and that understanding. And we also spent a little bit of time talking about the systems that we create at tier 1 and how they hopefully translate into the tier 2 and tier 3 systems. And those things are of parallel importance in terms of the how versus and the what. So that our little group spent, we left, our takeaway was we wish we had more time to talk to each other.
Yeah, thank you for that, Gina. Really appreciate it. I want to make sure we get a couple people to speak to the second question before we move on and then hit tier 3. Anything that's a priority for you next? I'm wondering, Jennifer, if you're thinking CBT groups might be a priority, you drop that in the chat, like kind of you're curious in that vein. Anyone else or Jennifer?
Yeah, I was curious. We have a lot of folks in our schools who are doing a lot of our bright work that are doing clinically informed work but aren't clinically trained. So I think that's an area just of growth for us. And I think just collaborating more with our counselors, it just trying to create more capacity in our buildings for people to do this work. Yeah.
I appreciate that, Jennifer. I think, what I'll call out is like, I think a lot of times we point to our clinical training as like our master's degree. And I think that there's a fair amount that happens there. That's true. But that was the starting point for our clinical training. Like if we thought that that was the end point for our professional learning and growth, sorely mistaken, right? We have to be forever learners and forever practitioners. It's called practice for a reason. We have to keep growing over time. Any other priorities for people? Tara, what you got?
I was just thinking, I actually feel like one of my priorities right now is to bolster the tier 1 things that are happening in the classroom, to reduce the number of on-calls that I have to take, to free me up to do more tier 2 as a guidance counselor. Because right now I'm sort of doing some whole group work in the classroom and a lot of on-call and a bare minimum of tier 2 work. But I think it's one of the things that has slid for us during the pandemic is we don't have as much face time with classroom teachers to bolster that tier 1, those tier 1 efforts.
Thank you for that, Tara. Great reflection. So in the interest of time, let's make sure, oh, Emily, go for it. What do you got?
I was going to jump up what Tara said, and like in our school, we had really good training that was provided, and we have the staffing and we have the training with CBT, but I think what we haven't caught up on, kind of going back to the whole, you can't really address academics until you address and stabilize the social emotional piece, that I don't know the district has caught up with that in terms of scheduling. So we're ready and like eager to run groups, but there's no time in the day. And so many of these kids who are the most in need are having 2 math classes, a separate reading and writing class. They're lucky if they get PE half the days. And it's just finding that time is tough.
Really great reflection, Emily. One thing I'll offer in that vein is we got to make time for it. We got to prioritize it. Sometimes that means that, yes, friends, a kid will miss an academic class. Oh my God, I said it. But that also means that we can do it in an intelligent way. What about waterfalling a group through a student schedule week to week, so that on Monday at 8, I'm missing English, oh my God, but next Monday at 9, I'm missing PE, and then next Monday at 10, I'm missing science. And then over the course of the entire treatment, you're really not hitting each class all that much. Oh, and by the way, you're getting them an evidence-based therapeutic support. Great. So food for thought there. Love the engagement. Sad that I got to keep moving on. Well, not sad, but it's mixed feelings. I want to keep hearing from all of you about your wonderful reflections. So tier 3, I'm not going to wax poetic over the triangle right now because we've talked about it enough, but I do want to talk about trauma-informed crisis response and critical incident management as being something that we have to orient to if we're going to have a trauma responsive and healing centered school. It's an essential component of it. Systems and practices need to be designed to ensure the safety of students and staff in advance of crisis so that we're not reacting, we are responding. Awareness of the approved procedures for managing crisis increases staff readiness and staff well-being. Why? Because term directionless pressure. I remember being on a hike in the woods, talking to Paul about another session on staff self-care, tripping over logs, and he shared with me this idea of directionless pressure, which is the idea that we can ease stress and tension in our staff through policy development, through giving them the procedures to actually respond to kids' needs. When you've got a lot of caring individuals who are trying to figure out how to navigate the space of kids in crisis, they don't feel great about not knowing how to respond. It increases their stress and their pressure. We can actually do a lot to alleviate that stress and pressure by putting good policy in place and giving them the tools and ideas and resources such that they can navigate that space effectively. So these are all hot linked in here. Crisis protocols for mental health staff, have at it. You can steal all this stuff. It's just, you know, those are more oriented to really kind of like COVID, but I've included some stuff later that is much more like temporal and that will help you moving forward. But we need this kind of stuff. STARS Toolkit, for those of you not in the Northeast, you might not have heard of the STARS team. School Threat Assessment and Response System, STARS. You would think I would know it, I'm on the team. The idea behind the STARS Toolkit is it's a way to respond, or I guess it's a ton of resources to respond to critical incidents. I don't want this to happen. I hope you never crack the STARS Toolkit open for this, but staff death, student death, in the wake of that horrific crisis, I want to make sure that you're well resourced and can respond so that we don't make a horrific situation worse, so that we can be well prepared to respond and help the community start to heal. This toolkit has some pretty fantastic resources in it that will ready you up for critical management, the critical incident management. So food for thought there. We have set up crisis recovery teams in our district that mirror STARS. STARS is really, it's out of NEMLEC, which is the Northeast Massachusetts Law Enforcement Council, and it's a regional crisis team where we're being dispatched out to districts that have experienced a really significant critical incident when they need more crisis counselors, when they need more staff in the halls to monitor student well-being, when they need more eyes on the student population. So we've worked to establish that in our district, and it's a nice warm blanket that makes us feel like if something goes sideways, we have a team on call that we can pull in, and it's an internal team such that we are not having to pull in this external team that we love. But at this point, the internal capacity build has allowed for us to feel like it's got to be pretty devastating if we're going to pull in the STARS now. We feel like we've done a good job building that capacity. So food for thought here. If you don't have a crisis team, it's worth considering. Here's a ton of resources for crisis response, home visit procedures. Anyone here have a home visit program? Quick show of hands. A couple hands went up. Okay. This was not it's not a perfect solution, but it's definitely in our bag of tricks to be able to help to reconnect with a family that's maybe dropped off the map. This came out of, you know, really the pandemic, where we had some families for whom we could not contact. We really wanted to lay eyes on to make sure they were okay. These home visits are not designed to be punitive in nature. It's really more about like, hey, we haven't heard from you. Are you okay? Can we get you any help? Let's make a connection. Know that we're here for you. Maybe let's meet next week. Let's meet tomorrow, whatever happens. I do want to call out the fact that when we're talking about individuals who have experienced trauma, they are 15 times more likely to commit suicide. That is a staggering statistic. It's scary. It means we have to be prepared to respond to the needs of our population in a way that accounts for this suicide risk assessment and threat assessment. If you don't already have suicide risk assessment procedures drafted, here are some protocols for you. If you don't already document suicide risk assessment, here's some documentation that you can look at. If you're looking for resources to support suicide risk assessment and you want to scale to use, this is something to look at. The Columbia Suicide Risk Severity Scale. It is endorsed by all the people you would want it to be endorsed by. SAMHSA, CDC. Bottom line is this. If I asked you, or if I told you, listen, there's a kid in your district right now that just said that they're going to kill themselves, who would you point to that would be conducting that suicide risk assessment? What tools would they use? What procedures would they follow? How would they document? And how would they interface with the larger crisis response team? I pose those questions because if we can't answer them, then when the time comes that we need to, we are going to be in a reactive stance as opposed to a responsive stance. Does that make sense to people?
Yeah.
Critical incident management, super important. I am passing the mic to Paul.
Great, John, yeah, if you don't mind just running this last few slides, that would
Got
be
it.
great. So I think the thing that we want to share is when we think about tier 3, for our team, quite often when we're doing MTSS mapping with schools, which we do as a starting point for schools that want to develop the Bright intervention, and we look at tier 3 in the mental health space, or in this case, in the trauma-informed space, often there's two things there. And one is some version of crisis response, a crisis team. You know, like most schools and districts have, you know, some pieces in place of crisis response. And then there's special education. And it's interesting because the question of tier 3 as thinking comprehensively about tier 3, we also believe that there's kind of another space in tier 3, which is what happens when a student returns following a crisis, whether that involves a hospitalization or other piece. Also, what happens with kids who are in the building more? You know, there may not have been a single crisis or a single extended absence, but who are really seriously struggling and who are falling behind because they're dealing with a trauma response and with a severe unaddressed trauma response, as an example. Which any of the sort of like, you know, bullets on here could respond. So I'm not here to sell Bright to you. Go ahead, if John, if you want to advance, but just to recognize that what we have learned about the space for students who need intensive supports, where it's not necessarily a disability, but it again may be a response to a serious trauma incident. It may be, you know, a significant mental health challenge, which may have ongoing mental health challenge, but may have trauma at its roots. These are the components for the intervention that we call Bright. You know, this notion of space, staffing being really clear that it's someone's responsibility to support students who are at a high level of need, and then kind of really specific customized plans. So, which these that we identify, these are the 4 components. So clinically informed supports for kids, academic coordination, and for younger kids, kind of a teacher collaboration piece, really proactive communication and support work with families, care coordination, and then systems level work. And just this idea that we back to the earlier conversation, we often feel like we have tier 1 and we have tier 3 and you don't have much tier 2. What we often see is we have identified kids who have a tier 3 need, but we're not always necessarily so well organized for how we respond to students. So we're dealing with them all the time, but we're not that well organized. So for folks who are interested, happy to talk more, but we think about Bright in a bunch of different ways, but one thing we think about it as a model for acknowledging and recognizing there will be students with a tier 3 level of need. And so how do we organize ourselves in order to best serve them? So that's what I want to say about Bright. Happy to talk more if folks would like to talk about that. And then the other thing that we just very often see is what folks think about as tier 3 is special education programming for students with identified emotional disabilities, right? So that takes up significant space and thinking time for folks in a lot of districts. And we have been thinking about kind of key questions in that regard, because there are many, many, many of these programs in schools. So, and we think that for those of you who have, essentially a tier 3 emotional disability program, whatever it's called, we feel like these are some key questions that we want to be asking. So is the work with kids, the instructional work with kids, trauma informed? And does it make sense to use that trauma informed classroom practice guide we looked at last time as a way of assessing and self-assessing with teachers? Is it a really truly therapeutic program? Honestly, I've heard a lot of programs named as therapeutic programs, but the question is, are they therapeutic? I love the way Courtney described a therapeutic setting earlier, and these are some of the features that we think about as therapeutic. So that it's proactive and goal-oriented rather than purely, primarily reactive, or as John said, it's about promoting active coping rather than just passive. That care coordination and family engagement are at the heart of the work, and that there's evidence-based practice grounding the therapeutic work that's happening with kids. So, and then how do we identify re-traumatization and what do we do about it with students who are in an intensive special education program? Do we have exit strategies? And I'm going to talk about that a little bit in a moment. And John, you may want to chime in about that as well. Including, do we have a plan for gradual return to regular classes? So we're not condemning a student to a lifetime of substantially separate special education when they very well may not need it. And then what's the alignment with other interventions in the school? So, so yeah, John, so if you want to advance, just to say a word, yeah, John, why don't you take this last slide or two? Because I feel like this is a way of framing it that you think is important. I will just say, we really believe that if there isn't the idea that we are lovingly but firmly nudging kids out of a tier 3 intervention from the very first moment that they enter a tier 3 intervention, we're actually doing a disservice to kids. So, but John, you may have a more eloquent way of saying that.
I think it's a wonderful way of putting it, Paul. No, I mean, at the end of the day, we have to reflect on the fact that our job as counselors, school psychs, is to become obsolete for our kids. Our job is to put the knowledge and skills on the table for them to take and for them to be able to do it alone. We want to become completely and totally useless to them. And maybe that's a harsh way of putting it, but at the end of the day, we don't want them to need us anymore. That's the goal. How wonderful for that to happen, for them to be able to have that efficacy such that they don't need us anymore. They can do it. And when we don't do that, and we don't do that an awful lot in schools, we never talk about termination. We never talk about graduation from services. We undermine student growth. We send a message that you're going to need services and supports forever, friend. You need therapy forever. That's not the kind of growth mindset message we want to send to kids. We reinforce reliance on a service, maybe. That's not great. We want our kids to feel like they don't need the service over time. There's all kinds of inefficiencies built into that. We can't move on to the next case that we know is waiting in the wings, for sure. And we also are not doing ourselves any favors in terms of fostering academic outcomes, because if a kid's getting a service that they don't need, then they're not in class. And we want them in class, ultimately, if they don't need the service. Think of it like this: beneficial, necessary. I want to provide services for students that need the service. Beneficial services are services that, I guess, like I'll say this, every kid could benefit from the individual attention of a caring adult that is going to try to help them work through their problems. Is it necessary or beneficial? And for those friends that attend IEP meetings and are frustrated when it's like, I think this kid would benefit from counseling on the grid, please push back if no data is on the table, because you might be undermining student growth if you just pop them into services. Okay. It should be a celebration. It should be cool. We should be excited. We should count the number of kids who roll through programs and get to the end. It should be the first thing we talk about when we enroll a kid in a tier 3 service. I want to get you to a point where you don't need me anymore, and here's the game plan to do that. We do not have time for breakout groups, friends, but I'm going to assume, since it's St. Patrick's Day, that you're all going to be getting together talking about this training, and you can do the breakout group wherever you want. It's going to be great. These are some databases that you can take a peek at that point at evidence-based services across, really across all tiers. And yeah, friends, hope you're going to take care of yourselves. I hope you're going to practice what you preach, and ultimately know that it's not selfish to take care of yourself. And we're rolling up on a weekend. I hope you'll take some time. Paul, Courtney, others, stuff to share? We are at the end. We've got some next steps to share.
Yeah, I mean, I will just say, yeah, thanks, John, and thanks everyone for joining us. Ellie just put the really short survey in the chat. If folks wouldn't mind just filling that out quickly in this last couple minutes, that would be great. The upcoming sessions specifically to this series related to trauma-informed and healing-centered practice are on your screen. So April 14th and then May 5th. Anyone is welcome kind of for any of these standalone sessions, and those of you who are in the coaching cohorts, excited to continue with these sessions, and also really excited. We're all excited to connect with you in the next few days and weeks to both kind of process today's session and then also keep working on the specific work that you're doing to move your work forward. So, and then you know where to find us. So, yep, I think we can wrap there.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Hope you have an awesome night. End to the week.
Thank you.